Marcus. So yes, I'm Jen Seavey. I'll be chairing today, and I think what we'll do is we'll start with some introductions from our guests. I'll have them speak a little bit about themselves, but just to introduce them as well. On the end here we have Dr. Neil Peach, who's a coordinator of the Spring Hill Community Group and a member of the South East Queensland Community Alliance. And we have Dr. Laurel Johnson, who's a Senior Research Fellow. And we have Dr. Laurel Johnson, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Queensland Institute of Social Science Research. To my right, Dr. Kavita Gonzalez, who is More-than-Human Futures alumnus. We're very proud. And the Sustainability Design Lead at Populous, which is just fabulous. And of course, Wendy Agan, who is the 2024 Greens candidate for the Brisbane City Council Central Board. Yes, great. So, shall we start then? Neil, would you like to take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself? And start.
Good morning, everyone. I'm part of the Spring Hill. Can you hear me okay? Yep. I'm part of the Spring Hill Community Group, and today I'm representing a number of community groups around Victoria Park, the Victoria Park Action Group, the Normanby Action Group, Brisbane Residents United, South East Queensland Community Alliance, and also a little bit of input from the Kelburn Grove Urban Village. And essentially, I suppose we've been learning over the last 18 months to connect with one another and try to work out how to deal with what the Brisbane City Council and the Queensland Government propose in regard to Victoria Park. And I think from that process, what we've learned is that it takes time to talk to one another, and it really does require you to sort of hold back a bit and try to incorporate other groups into what it is that you're doing. So that's the first learning. The second learning is that much of the engagement that we've undertaken over the last 18 months has been complete and utter subterfuge. So what we're confronted with is a whole heap of documents and technical material and photographs and insights into the future, and none of it is statutory, has any consequence whatsoever, and is a complete subterfuge. The third thing we've learned is that single projects are good, but you've really got to wire in and try to go for the long run, because essentially there are no, I'll call it, big wins. Whenever you win, it's a silent victory. It's like the Matildas scoring a goal and no one in the audience saying anything. When you get a little win, like not having a car park built in a park, no one says, we changed our mind because of what you said. So you've got to keep working in the silence of what it is that inspires you to do what you're doing. And to do that, you really have to talk to other people. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? How do I follow that up? I feel like a bit of a fraud, really, because I'm from the southwest edge of Brisbane in a community called Inala, and so I don't know a lot about Barrambin, but Neil and Kavita have been furnishing lots of technical reports, these technical reports Neil talks about, and you can do your head in a bit. So my name's Laurel and I'm a town planner, and I've been a town planning educator at the 3 unis in South East Queensland, and I'm currently working as a researcher at University of Queensland in social science research, which is good because social scientists are realising we need to think a bit spatially. We need to just stop thinking about people, think about how they connect to each other, how do they connect to land and space. Just a couple of observations about Barrambin or Victoria Park is that I think Neil's being really modest, because I think there have been some extraordinary victories for the community groups that have formed an alliance together there to engage with council on the planning of this extraordinary space. I mean, on the positive, you got that car park out of a park. The other positive is that as a community in Brisbane, we now have 64 hectares of land, most of which is publicly accessible. Before, most of it wasn't. So there's well done. And I think there's others in Brisbane. This is where, Neil's saying it's silent, but I think we all know that, and we all owe them a great deal of debt, and we're grateful to you for it. I guess on the negative side for this particular development in our city is that it's a bit tricky. The master plan that's been released it leaves the door open to two critical things. One is more hard surfaces, and the second is car parking. So while Neil's group's had a victory to get rid of a multi-storey out of the plan, it does say we'll monitor the car parking and see what happens over time. And so, this idea of permanence it's a nonsense. This thing is alive. And I guess my final observation, first I should say a little bit, sorry, about myself and Inala. So I'm the president of a large organisation. We have a community legal service and a neighbourhood centre, and it's a fully community-run management committee, which is now getting less and less obvious, and there's less and less of us, where residents actually run the community organisations in their area. Back to your point about competition, there's lots of competition in the non-government sector. There was some of them perform like corporations. Ours is a small organisation, and we do well, and we have residents running that out in the Nala. Now, my final observation is about how we value land. And, I don't really want to pick on this particular administration in Brisbane, but how can you not? There just seems to be, the dominant value of land is as a commodity. Whether it has trees on it, whether it is a client's house, whether it is commodified. So land is a commodity. It is an economic value. That's what dominates. There may be other values that are tacked on, as we've seen with Barrambin, but they are secondary to the overarching value of land as a commodity. And you all know that, and we all experience that in Brisbane, and that is the slow game. How do we shift that? That's a systemic shift that we need to take, and planting trees in your own backyard, building your verge garden, doing those amazing things, that's part of your commitment to almost undermining this ethos that land is commodity. Land is so much more, and it's much more about just us than humans as well. It's more than human. So I'll shut up. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Hi, I'm Kavita Gonsalves. I'd like to pay my respects to Turrbal and Yagara people. I've been very lucky to work on this country and be able to do wonderful things out here, run a couple of projects, so that's been really good. I recently completed a PhD called Radical Placemaking, and which I think connects to the Victoria Park quite well, which is the project of Transhuman Saunter, where as a person of color, a settler out here, I focused on those experiences with other artists who are who equally identify as people of color. And we looked at our connection to the Indian banyan tree, which is a silent tree that sits out here that nobody really knows why it's even there. I would say it's a migrant like me out here, and that's the connection we share, but it's a more accepted migrant compared to someone like me. So we created this project. It's based out in the Brisbane Brisbane City Botanic Gardens. There are 4 pieces of artist walks over there. And the most important thing that I go back to with that project is that the tree is an ecosystem. And as you would have seen with the recent cutting of the tree that I remember Marcus just sharing on his Facebook wall, a 400-year-old tree was cut down in Tasmania, and that broke my heart to see that happen. So with Victoria Park, I'm quite interested in how the system would work, how it connects to all these different natural heritage, or I don't know a better word for it right now, it's not coming to mind, but how do all of these systems come together to actually keep us alive? I think when we talk about the world is burning, we just have to remember the earth kind of does not care about us. It will spew us out. So what we're really talking about is our own, whether we will continue to survive as humans out here if we don't really take care of what we have. So, yeah. Moving from that, I'm currently working as a sustainable design lead at Populous, which is an architecture firm out here, and really looking at how we can, with the ongoing, Brisbane is going to come in, is going to have a lot of change, for example, with the Olympics coming in, and Populous has a big stake in it. Once you look at the website, you'll know why. And I'm particularly invested in how people, non-humans, are connected within the Olympics, and what does that mean for the city of Brisbane, for the people of Brisbane, and flora and fauna that exist out here.
Can you hear me? Yes? Everyone has to check that. I'd also like to pay acknowledgement, although you can't beat that video. That was amazing. I've never seen that before. One little piece of information which I did give at the conference, but I think is particularly pertinent when we're talking about Barrambin, is there's an app that was developed by some local First Nations in conjunction with some researchers called Virtual Maywa. Look it up, and it actually shows some of the traditional campsites around Brisbane pre-colonisation, which includes the north side of Brisbane around Victoria Park, Barrambin, Bowen Hills area. And I think it's particularly interesting to look at some of the history there. I just would like to mention that. So I'm Wendy Agdam. I am a candidate, which feels like it's just kind of fallen upon me because my previous and current life is as a child mental health nurse. I've been working with families in a volunteer and paid capacity for nearly 20 years. I've also been a local. I lived on Hurston Road for about 5 years. I now live in Fortitude Valley and have used Barrambin and the local area for that whole time. I now have a 5-year-old and we love visiting there. I'm so pleased that it's been taken away from its golf course history. Now we take along old cardboard boxes so she can slide down the hills and just enjoy the open space and the shade and the trees. It's beautiful. In my professional capacity, working as a child mental health nurse, I just love working with people and seeing the effect of I guess, the living, their living surroundings on them. And I see such a huge connection between people that are disconnected and possibly not using outdoors and space. And I'm a bit of a data nerd, which seems a bit in conflict when you're talking about that real interpersonal work because you can't quantify that. But you can just see so much in the evidence of what outdoors, green space, usable connections and third spaces that bring people together and the effect on mental health. When I visited some of my husband's family in Norway, there was a bit of a project in Oslo where they just provided space to people to use as community gardens, to produce food. And it was interesting, they put it out to all residents and yet over 75% of all the people that took upon it were migrants and people from refugee backgrounds. And the studies on that were just so interesting that when I visited that 5 years ago, I just did a bit of a deep dive into the research, which relates so much to what we do now. And I did a little bit of an update in preparation for today, and it just continues to blow my mind how much you can show quantifiably how much green space, open space, parks can bring people together. And there is no particular thing to say that green space and trees and parks are the thing that improve mental health, but it's everything that comes with it. So hopefully I can bring a little bit of that along with it. Yeah, thank you everyone.
That's great, thank you. Well, just following up on that, this idea that green space and everything that comes with it, I think this has been a thread in some of the discussions today as well, this idea and what Tim has said and things from the panelists, that there are lots of different facets and you also said, Camille, that the tree is an ecosystem. So if we think about things kind of more broadly, and we think about how, and then the agents or the concerns or the stakeholders that are involved in Victoria Park and Barrambin, and how we might move them forwards in or sustain or keep that in a positive light that is healthy for those agents. I guess one of my first questions would be to the panel, who do you see as being the key stakeholders in Barrambin, and where do you see, and what do you think we could maybe do to be able to move that forward? So I might start with you, Laurel, and then move to Neil, or anyone else wants to jump in.
It's a tough question, isn't it? Key stakeholders for that space. I think we all have a stake in it as far as Brisbane residents and visitors. I think we all have a stake in that one. I mean, one of my observations of that park, and it probably picks up on your point, Wendy, is that it is across the road from a hospital. And a few years ago, my daughter was very sick. Sorry, I won't get emotional now. And she was in a children's hospital, and we're across the road from South Bank. But getting access to South Bank from the children's hospital with a kid in a wheelchair is almost impossible. And so for me, I would hope that one of the key stakeholders there is people who are needing healing across the road from an amazing healing space, and that we think about access to people who are resident there for a short time, which is a tricky time for them and their families. Yep.
I think that question is an opportunity just to mention that recently we submitted a complaint which went through 4 processes of review within the Brisbane City Council, and that gave us the framework for going to the Ombudsman in regard to the misuse of information during the process. And what we learned from that was that I put forward a submission to the Ombudsman on the basis of being affected by the impacts of the proposed plan. And much to my surprise, the response from the Ombudsman was that I was not directly impacted by the process. So as an individual, I could not demonstrate that I had a connection, most people would call it stakeholder, to actually make a complaint about that issue. So in terms of the status of things and the system that we're talking about, I suppose there is the more than human concept, but there is the less than human concept. And essentially that's part of what you feel when you engage in these processes, and why talking is so important, because you're never acknowledged as a person. You are a constituent who is making a complaint, and you are dealt with according to a systematic framework where you can't ever actually feel like you're engaging. And the way in which the email and the letters are produced exclude you from actually ever feeling like you are someone doing something. So I think that's just a handy little dimension to keep in mind, and part of the reason for conveying it is that you've got to get over it. Because in a sense, what you're dealing with is a technology called the city, and the city has all of these stakeholders that have a vested interest in us not existing as humans. And as long as we assume or expect to be a human, I suppose we need to keep doing that, but the system will not recognise you. And so you need other people to make sure you feel like a human being. Otherwise, you're not in for the long game.
Also, just follow up on that, Neil. Was there a sort of a boundary that was drawn that you were outside? I mean, I guess I'm wondering if if the view of who is a stakeholder is actually something that needs to be reframed. Why were you told that you were not what were the grounds of saying that you had no investment in this?
The grounds were that I want no individual that I'm aware of that's involved in the community groups could have put an argument that fell within the province of that complaint, because all we were ratepayers, and there was a democratic system in place that resolved the way in which things were done, and the only way I could pursue that was to keep on going through the Brisbane City Council process. So all of the processes that they've undertaken might look like planning, might feel like planning, but they are a complete subterfuge, and part of what community groups need to understand is that's what's happening. So with all the neighbourhood plans across Brisbane, they will, in the next tranche of the South East Queensland plan, be wiped out. And what's happened at Kurilpa with the temporary planning permit is the way in which the state government and the Brisbane City Council, essentially two state governments, are now in total lockstep. So the state government's approval of Kurilpa is now what the Brisbane City Council is doing at Victoria Park, is that they've taken it out of the standard planning system and put it into a thing called a local government infrastructure designation, which is code for producing 1,000 pages of technical reports and giving it to the Minister for Planning, and he signs the approval on the back of a postage stamp. So you are left in this nothingness where you can't get anything assessed against a criteria or a framework because it's signed off. So the planning system has now designed a system within the planning system so that you can avoid the planning system.
I'm so glad that I've been able to meet with Neil before, and he's been able to share some of his information. I can freely admit that I don't have the time to look at all of this in my current life. I work as a nurse, I'm a mum, I manage that, and now I'm doing this candidacy. And it's enormous, the amount of content that they're providing. So Brisbane City Council administration at the moment don't care who the stakeholders are, because the only ones that they're listening to are the ones that have the time and the money and the expertise to be able to trawl through all of this. And even when I had some time to look at some of this information to do a submission, because I thought this would be great, I really want to do a submission myself. I'm looking at all this information, the hoops you have to go through, the technical language that's expected. I'm like, okay, I need to call some planning friends and to be able to translate some of this for me, because it's ridiculous. The only people that are going to be able to do submissions are people that have a vested interest and are probably paid by another company to go through this and do a submission for them, which is horrendous. So, and if we're thinking more than human, even though I'm looking at the human evidence of the green space and this amazing park that we have, at our doorstep, a lot of the evidence and the stakeholders are the people that won't, are the things and the beings and the environment that won't have a say. We won't know the effect of that for another 20 years before we find out what bird populations return to that area, what biodiversity is going to return to that area. And we don't know that, and we can't say that, but they are often the biggest stakeholders.
Yeah. You can talk to this on so many levels, both in terms of your PhD work and your role.
Every time I fill a form over here, I'm reminded of this book by David Graeber on bureaucracy. I think it's called, 1,000 Years. I can't remember the name of the book, but so it sounds like a lot of the planning processes here is just to create more paperwork, waste people's time, and not really get good outcomes. It's driven by this little system of capitalism. Anyways, I'll go back to the question, which is who do we see as stakeholders of Barrambin? And to me, I think everyone is a stakeholder in the sense that we breathe the air that Barrambin offers us all the time. So from that perspective, everyone. But from the perspective of who says what should happen over there, I guess I go back to my PhD around radical placemaking, to the term radical itself, which the etymology of it is roots, to go back to our roots. And for me, I think as a settler over here, and I'm always conscious of bringing this up, but and it makes me deeply uncomfortable, but because they're not here and they are not speaking for themselves, and I can do my best here, but it's the First Nations groups who I feel should primarily have a say in what should happen to Barrambin. What it should become for them, for the city. I think they have an innate connection to country and land, which I don't have as someone who has moved continuously, and I really respect that. So that's who I think should be the primary stakeholders with that.
And to note that if you look at the draft plan, the master plan, there is this lip service, for lack of another term, to say that look at this amazing connection to country that we're going to have. We're going to have these, Aboriginal shows for tourists, which again are commodified. And they're not treated as true stakeholders, but instead as a show. Yeah, unfortunately.
I think as I was looking through some paperwork, and I shared it as well, I do know that, I cannot comment on it, but I do know that Blacklash Creative they're a First Nations group. They have been involved with the Victoria Master Plan, the draft. I don't know the extent of the involvement. It's hard for me to say. I do not know, but yeah, I know that they have been involved. Yeah, that's, I guess there's a dialogue and conversation that needs to be made with them. Yeah,
So in that regard, in response to the fact that the major part of the park being subject to redevelopment is under a local heritage listing. The local heritage listing is primarily acknowledging its golf history. So that's point one. The part of the park on the southern side of the transport corridor is state heritage listed, and we believe that on the basis of the historical work done by many researchers, Daki Yaka and the Turrbal people, that has been was a campsite for them for hundreds of years, and Daki Yaka contributed enormously to trying to build some bridges between the first settlers and the First Nations people. And what we've also learned is that the cultural connection of the Turrbal people is actually now anthropologically connected with the riverine cultural block in Australian Aboriginal history. Now, that means that it's the most easterly connection of the Murray River Aboriginal history in Queensland, and the Turrbal people, as part of that cultural block, are distinct from the groups south and north of Brisbane on the coast. So there is a really compelling reason why this should be recognised, not only from that early history, but the number of activities that have taken part on that site in terms of needy people, servicemen during the Second World War, and a range of other activities. We certainly see, we've just made a presentation to the Queensland government in regard to estate heritage listing, because essentially what the council's moved towards the LGID process is that all of the state interests have to be considered all at once, and our objective is to try and make sure that both the Department of Natural Resources, because it's a deed of grant in trust under the Land Act, and also the state environment people actually take their obligations seriously in regard to considering the future use of the land. So I suppose one of the other learnings, which I didn't mention earlier, is that in terms of dealing with any one of these projects, what we've found is that the only energy that you ever get from the government, be it local, state or Commonwealth, is if you can find another level of government that's not doing something according to the other level of government's requirements. They get really excited. They're not vaguely interested in community engagement, but if they can find something at another level of government isn't doing that it should do. So in fact, we've identified that one of the most direct strategies is to actually find variations between the platforms, because it gets really hard if all of the platforms are all lined up. And in South East Queensland, the Commonwealth platform, the state platform and the local platform are absolutely in lockstep, and growth is the only basis for our future. Beyond growth, nothing else matters. But if you get into the local scene and try to find some variation between the local plan and the state plan, or the state plan and the Commonwealth plan, you've actually got the potential of getting some bureaucrats interested in having a fight.
Which it's interesting that if you talk about that as a behaviour, because I work with young children, if you get children that manipulate the adults in their life and try to find differences, that's seen as a very manipulative, disordered behaviour. But it's not the child's fault. It's just a symptom of the system that has been created around them. So residents are being driven to find splits between the authorities in their life to try and take advantage of this, which it's so unfortunate that all the community groups have been driven to this. You've done such amazing work, Neil, all the hours and hours and thousands of dollars that you've put towards this.
I think the important thing is to recognise that in order to make a difference, you've got to be able to see what the system is called. You've got to know the game. You can't play it and stay in it if you don't understand what you're being subjected to. And so it's not about picking on the people in government or whatever. It's about understanding how the rules of the game are played, and that you've then got to employ what's available to you, because we're never going to win, but the issue is not scoring the goals. The issue is playing the game. And that's the thing, that it takes a long time and a lot of hitting your head against a brick wall to realise that if the game wasn't there, everything will be lost. There will be no local. Whilst we've got a game, it doesn't matter if you're losing. Have fun, enjoy it, take the opportunity of playing the game, because otherwise you'll get burned out, and so many of my colleagues are in that boat. It's no use thinking you're going to win. Winning is actually playing the game, because when we're not here, there is no local. And when there is no local, then it's just a blank piece of paper. I say that because everyone, whether you're in government or consulting firms or whatever, everyone's just got their own reasons. It's not as though the people in this building or the building down the road are different to us. They're playing the game. We've got to get better at the game we are playing, and connections and and viability depends on having a time connection with other groups through time. Otherwise, they beat us on lack of memory every time. By the way, I've got 2 hard copies of the South East Queensland Regional Plan. They're a kilogram each. And if anyone does want a hard copy, please come and see me later, because it's really hard to get your head around 267 pages, and some people still like to look at hard copies. So.
A good one. It's interesting you mention it as a game, because it's certainly a game that none of us in this room are really invited to play. Like, I know that there's a planning subcommittee on council. The main stakeholders, if we're still talking about stakeholders, are developers who are actually on this council's planning subcommittee. Residents are not invited. Councillors are often not even invited. But developers are primarily on this subcommittee.
It sounds like you're also reinventing the rules of the game, though, if you're actually going and identifying differences between council approaches and that internal competition between government, and using that to actually get some action forwards. I wonder if there are other mechanisms that you might be able to, other games that might actually be able to get the results that you want. Are there other strategies or possibilities that could be considered here? One of the things that occurs to me is that the Barrambin plan looks a lot like Southbank. It's like the rainforest mudflats version of Southbank, with tokenistic kind of York's Hollow here, which incidentally is an area apparently of Indigenous significance, and yet that's not the key point of the design, the plan. It's really still seems to be defined by the car park and the freeway. But and so I'm thinking that the planning and the design decisions there are probably looking at Southbank, and the same as they might be looking at what other councils are doing or other government departments are doing. So the narrative and the decision making there is being informed by these things and the stakeholder engagement in the community is just playing such a small role. So I wonder, are there other opportunities for this sort of creative game playing and strategizing that you've identified successfully, Neil? And if anybody has any thoughts on that too.
Certainly, part of what we've learned over the last 18 months is to try to have a game plan that's not just about complaining. So where we started from was actually developing a Spring Hill Vision 2035 and try to build a range of projects that would help us build a version of what we wanted, as opposed to simply having placards in front of the site, because usually that means you've already lost.
That sounds great. Can I know, just quickly want to ask Kavita and Laurel, in terms of your work with architecture and town planning, do you think that there might be opportunities for reaching out to people that are designing visions independent of council, that you could actually liaise, and sort of create other alternatives as well?
Yes. And communities create visions for themselves all the time.
The Weka community and QUT More Futures communities have got visions for that site, which is now the subject of the TLPI, as Neil was talking about. You might have heard in the media 90 stories. It's not 90 stories, it's no height limit. It's not 90 stories. There is no height limit in that TLPI. It's not 90, just keep looking up. The sky's the limit, literally, and it refers to aerospace constraint. Is the only constraint on that site. So for the first time ever in the city, the CBD is spilling over to the south side. I actually think South Bank is an example of an extraordinary victory for the people of Queensland. We won that. That was through change of government. That was a fight to win South Bank. The design for South Bank was a private mooring, a private yacht mooring. So they were going to eat into the edge of the river and create a mooring to some lovely high-end apartments. That was the design for South Bank post-Expo. And because people had experienced Expo in the city, they went nuts over that, said, no way, we want that. We want access to that site. That's going to be public space. And that is the most highly valued land in the city. Yet, you look at it, it's all to the river, no development, and then it stages back very gently. The barbecues are free, the toilets are free, the pool's free, they're all nice and clean all the time. You see groups down there, if you looked out there, there'd be lots of family groups and different groups coming together there. Like, I think South Bank is a bit of a victory for the city, but it took a political change at the state level. It took a massive seismic shift where we got rid of our conservatism, got rid of the National Party stronghold and moved to Labor, which is, had a whole lot of problems as well, but at least we got South Bank out of it. So I think
South Bank is pretty significant. The thing about South Bank, though, is that it really caters for Brisbane and visitors and tourists. It's not necessarily working for a local community. There is a herb garden, there's a vegetable garden, but it's more for show rather than actually community garden.
Yeah, like my story, trying to get my kid out of the wheelchair down into there, have some healing in nature, it's impossible. So yeah, we've got a very particular
So Barrambin is a tension there because there are residents around there. There are and human residents as well. So it's trying to do all that, and yet it's penned in by all these freeways, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly, I think that part of what today is about for me is what Bernard Stiegler refers to. Because cities all around the world are encountering exactly what we're encountering. And he calls for a new urban genius, which is essentially a connection between the academy, between the community, between business, and that only by bringing those groups together will you have enough performativity. You've got to be able to deliver. So that the ideas and the concepts and the let's say the assessments are all gone. The only thing that it is determined by is performativity. If you've got the weight of corporate intent, you can do almost whatever you like. Formalism is gone. So the idea that a development approval is going to challenge a developer's design is almost, it's sort of long past history. Essentially, the government, the corporates and the money are congealed in a system called city, and we've got to find a worthy opponent, an urban genius that brings together our energy and intellect and the academy and the consultants and start playing a different game.
Fantastic. I think we do have to have a question shortly. Kavita, did you?
Yeah. I don't know if I have an alternative strategy, but I have a couple of steps. The first one is probably you need anger. You need to be angry about what's happening. The second one is, I know you don't like a mission statement, but you do need to know what your values are. So setting what the values need to be. The third one is finding the collective, going back to exactly what Neil said. Who is the collective within business, institution, corporates, etc. The fourth one is, again, going back to what Neil said, is we don't need the complaint. It's not going to be very useful. That's where anger fits in very well. You need an evidence-based approach. So what is the evidence and what is it pointing to? And the fourth one is, that's probably the fifth one. This is a long game that we're playing. So the creative strategy, and I think exactly the way, whenever I'm frustrated, I think of it as a game. It's a game I have to play. Who are the players? What are the rules? What are the rules I can break? That's the most important one, I think. So yeah, that's kind of where I come from. Yeah.
Fantastic. Should we open it up to questions from the audience?
I just have a question.
Can
I've
you
worked.
please wait for the microphone?
Sorry, thanks, Marcus. My name's Rose. I've worked a fair bit with Neil on Victoria Park, and I really appreciate the work Neil does, because he really, a few conversations, he's grounded me as I ring up, and he's like, Rose, it's a long game. It's been extremely stressful. But one of the probably the questions I have is, we've got a room of people here who are intellectual enough and who want to analyse and who want to think and try to move things forward. How do you garner the general public? Because in our area, in Hurston, and I'm literally just down the road from Vic Park, we had a Parks on Car Parks campaign about Inaugural Creek, which was really important, and I did a great job. The amount of concrete being overlaid there, the amount of activisation of green space was probably a drop in the ocean compared to Vic Park. But trying to get the people who had parks, not car parks, all on their fence and their placards interested in Vic Park was exceedingly difficult. And you can try to educate, it seems like one-on-one education. I don't know how, with the amount of energy, and we've got small groups, how we garner that, because that's where, we need to garner more people to actually see what's going on.
Would like to take that question.
That's so tricky, and I guess that's often, that political strategy is how do you, simplify your message? How do you get people on board? I know that if we're playing that long game, it's really, and I was talking about this term actually with Stephen in the audience here. There's a term called backcasting, which is where you have your vision and then you work back from that. And often that's really hard for people, because if you ask people, what do you see for this community? What do you see for this park in 20 years? That's a bit too much sometimes. Like, oh, I don't know. And people are not asked that when they're asked to kind of politically engage or talk about things. We've come across this in our door knocking. You ask people, what do you want? I don't know, because no one's ever actually asked me this. And that's, I guess, just a symptom of that more global, corporatization and demanding stresses, and the fact that people don't have time to think about this and actually be engaged in their community. So I would actually say the first step is just engaging the community in being with each other, connecting people, and that conversation will just start to plant seeds, and they'll start to think, actually, we want more of this, or we want more of this.
So I found with Vic Park, just an anecdote, I won't take up too much more time, but I work on Vic Park. I also run the Hurston Kelvin Grove community group. We've got about 3,500 people. I also do community events, so I know a lot of people. So we're trying to originally in the vision, there was no skate park at Vic Park. Let's call it a skate park, or a park, skate park. There was nothing, it wasn't in there. So suddenly it miraculously appears and is subject to a consultation that comes out sort of randomly, ad hoc, middle of last year. So you try to educate people that they're putting this skate park next to the Murray Spinazzi Nature Street, this reserve that this man had developed. They're going to put lights in there. I know there are curlies there. Trying to educate the community that I'm in on that was next to impossible, because as soon as they heard skate park, they were like, oh, great skate park. And then we had Brisbane City Council using information on my site that I run, that I created, I run with a friend of mine, and using those quotes from people saying they like the skate park as validation for having the skate park. Now that forum is a private forum, so we've had to make sure that no government officials are on it. But that's an example of how you try to educate people. And the same people who didn't want parks not car parks campaign wanted the skate park. So that's, it just makes it very hard to do.
And they're capitalising on that youth disengagement, which is just my work. I spoke a couple of days ago at the conference about youth engagement, and I mentioned, what's council's solution to youth engagement? Just chuck a skate park there. What percentage of youth actually use skate parks, and how are they actually engaged? Is that actually a good space for them? Are they mentored? Are they held in a good space? Are they actually given activities, and do they contribute to does that engage pro-social behaviours? So that's just my comment on the skate park. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm Beth and I'm from Spring Hill Community Group too. There's just one thing that hasn't been said here, and that is that the council has actually now transferred the Barrambin into its private company that it runs, and that is the Parkland Services Proprietary Limited. So it is actually a private company. So any income that will be made from all these secondary uses, from the existing secondary uses and the future secondary uses, will not become part of the council budget. It will become part of the budget of this private company that is not public knowledge. So nobody will know what the leases will be, what the rents will be, what the whole sort of financial arrangement of what this park will be. And it's already now been moved over, like South Bank is in this company, and also Rose Street Parkland. And you don't see those financials in any of the council reports. So that is another way that they are completely keeping Barrambin separate from the council business as well. You know.
Another question here.
Nick Cohen, I live near Dutton Park, which is a smaller park than Barrambin, but it's still significant on the south side and under a lot of threat with infrastructure and so on. I'm just wanting to ask a practical question of Neil and perhaps some of the other members of the Spring Hill Group, is in terms of your structure and communication strategies, do you set up as a community incorporated association, or are you a loose unincorporated group? Do you have monthly meetings with minutes and office bearers, or how much do you communicate via person-to-person meetings, door knocking, social media pages and so on? Some of that communication and engagement strategy, can you fill us in a bit on how you actually work?
I wish I knew. I think it would be fair to say, and to some degree this is a response to Rose, which she's going to be very unhappy with, I think. And that is that the objective for our group, which is relatively small, has been greatly benefited by connecting with other groups, like Rose's group, like the Normanbury group. So we don't have the capacity to allocate jobs, and it's all random. And so the only time that I put into trying to convince someone in our community is to try and connect with people who have a little bit of energy to do something. Because if I spent my time trying to educate the people in our area about things, I wouldn't do any of the work that was necessary to actually sustain the approach. So my suggestion is, don't think about incorporated associations, don't think about anything other than finding people with enough energy to get up the next day and do something that they're not going to see the results for the next 15 years.
There you go. Inspired.
My name's Andy Grudeski. I do a Mum Jolly Country down in the scenic room. I'm also a PhD candidate with the More-than-Human Futures group, but inactive in that group because I'm doing a PhD. But Neil's comments about the whole gaming of the process really resonates me, and being a burnt-out activist for many years, I really relate to it. But there's some the question is what role do you think values have in this whole process? And one of the reasons I say that is in the Scenic Rim, we're celebrating 10 years of a big community action to stop coal and gas coming to the Kerry Valley and coal coming to other parts of the Scenic Rim, which ended up in this whole big protest around the changing government. And we that whole interest in the values of the Scenic Rim became articulated in the Scenic Rim's community plan. And that was recently used to lobby the Minister for, in government, I should remember the name of the department, Energy and Mines, whatever it is now, to basically rescind any exploration licences for coal and coal seam gas in the Scenic Rim, but based on the articulated values of the community. And your other comment about the individual not being recognised is, about the whole idea of recognising the values that the individuals have, and whether that you see that as an important strategy as part of this whole Barrambin challenge that the direction is taking.
Well, I'll actually say that the values certainly resonate with me as an academic. So when the values come up in terms of people's concerns, I think that is one way in which we can bridge all of our different areas. But I think that, does any of the other panel members want to comment on the role of values in this, and are we being naive? Is there a way forwards? What do you think? Should we finish on a high note? Let's try and finish on a high note.
Well, let's finish. Let's have one low note. I think there's a contest of values here, and yours are probably more clearly articulated than the values that you're up against, which is this commodification of land, and that unless it's got a financial and economic value, it doesn't have a value. That's its dominant value. So, and that's how the whole system is structured around that valuing. So you're always going to be up against that. And just picking up Rosa's point, I think I think local is beautiful. You can stay local. I like the idea of a coalition across the city, across the state, across the globe, and let's hope we get there. But I'm also really happy to just work in my local park, pulling out weeds and planting there with other community members, because that makes me feel good. That makes me connect with people, and I can do something effective locally. Like, I just admire Neil. I don't know how he's done it. Just keep pushing up against these systems that are unbreakable, impenetrable, because it's a contest of values, and those just don't line up with yours. That's it, bottom line. So I think there's something beautiful about local. Let's think globally, act locally, an old terminology, but I think, there's something in that, and if local connects with other local, how magnificent is that? But you only have so much energy. We have short lives. We are short visitors here. Short visitors in a long game. So what can we do effectively within our short time?
I would make a comment in regard to just our local area, Spring Hill. And that is, in Spring Hill every week now, there are 26 separate locations providing food for people who can't get enough. 26 locations in inner city Brisbane every week. So the values of a community are on display in every lineup, in every corner of every park, in certainly my part of Brisbane. And I suppose that there is a requirement, and I know this sounds highfalutin, but there is a requirement for the revaluation of values, because this system or this process, the current world, requires us to act locally, otherwise nothing else will happen of any consequence. So I believe the values are about engaging at an individual level in your own territory as the basis for building the knowledge that's required within our group. And I suppose working with, in my mind, I have as a paragon, and forgive me if it goes against anyone's values, but I have followed the life of Noam Chomsky, and Chomsky is now 92, and when he was in his early 40s or 50s, his wife went and made sure she got learned, and she became a professor because she was convinced that Noam was going to end up in jail before too long. Noam is still presenting to community groups around the world in regard to the values that he ascribes to, and I think it's values that put us very much in sync in the First Nations values that we can build on in our particular parts of the world.
Kalia and then Wendy.
Yeah. A couple of months ago, I attended a little session. It was kind of a big session amongst a lot of people around the Olympics. And one of the things that came up was around what kind of values do we want to present during the Olympics. And one of the things that came out was the concept of welcome. We need to be welcoming. We need to welcome everybody in. We're going to have lots of visitors and things like that during the Olympics. And me, as I was standing there, I just brought up that when we talk about the concept of welcome, how much are we really remembering those who are marginalized and voiceless within our systems? And I was speaking about, we still have asylum seekers sitting on an island, for example, or in other parts of the country, sitting in some version of camps, trapped, unable to get out and just breathe air and enjoy life, make the most of their time out here. And then it goes back to also what do we want to demonstrate when we talk of the more than human who are equally voiceless, and what does that mean? So the less than human, lesser than human groups that sometimes I think I'm sitting in, depending on context, I'm sitting within these fixtures and convergences. So so values are really going to be the thing that help us, that make us stand out, and the point being that if we are playing the back game, if we're playing the long game, and if we're backcasting, say 50 years, 100 years from now, what do we really want to be remembered for? And that's what our values are actually going to take us there on that. So I do think values are very, very important. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. If we just purely look at the evidence, commodifying spaces does not lead to improved wellbeing. Green spaces do, bringing communities together do, keeping people active does. If your only value is financial value, which is what we've been sold if we have this park that brings all this money to the city, everyone's lives will be better. There is no evidence to suggest that. If we, this leads to possibly another session, is if we, make this airport bigger and bring all this money to Brisbane, we're going to make people's lives better. That's just not true, and the evidence is there. If we provide there's three, whenever you look at any green spaces, there's really three things that you look at which does improve people's wellbeing. It's proximity to green space, it's the quantity of green space, so making sure there's enough of it for everyone, and it's the quality of the green space. It's what makes it accessible, what makes it usable for people. If you just provide a green space with no toilets or no, intergenerational spaces, that's not actually going to improve people's wellbeing. It's got to be usable in some way as well. So proximity, quantity and quality. No money, no financial. That actually is a barrier to people coming and using that green space, and therefore it's not going to be any benefit to people's well-being.
Great, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel.